Una nación que continúa año tras año, gastando más dinero en defensa militar que en programas de mejoras sociales, avanza hacia la muerte espiritual.
March 13th, 1962. Lyman Lemnitzer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, presents a proposal to Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, named Operation Northwoods. The document proposed staging terrorist attacks in and around Guantanamo Bay to provide a pretext for military intervention in Cuba. The plans included starting rumors about Cuba using clandestine radio, landing friendly Cubans inside the base to stage attacks, starting riots at the main gate, blowing up ammunition inside the base, starting fires, sabotaging aircraft and ships on the base, bombing the base with mortar shells, sinking a ship outside the entrance, staging funerals for mock victims, staging a terror campaign in Miami, Florida, and Washington, D.C., and finally, destroying a drone aircraft over Cuban waters. The passengers, federal agents in reality, would allegedly be college students on vacation. A plane at Eglin Air Force Base would be painted and numbered as a duplicate of a registered civil aircraft belonging to a CIA front in Miami. The duplicate would be substituted for the real plane and loaded with the passengers. The real plane would be converted into a drone. The two planes would rendezvous south of Florida. The passenger-laden plane would land at Eglin Air Force Base to evacuate its passengers and return to its original status. The drone would pick up the scheduled flight plan and, over Cuban waters, transmit a Mayday signal before being blown up by remote control. The plan is rejected by McNamara, and President John F. Kennedy personally removes Lemnitzer as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. December 1st, 1984. A remote-controlled Boeing 720 takes off from Edwards Air Force Base and is crash-landed by NASA for fuel research. Before its destruction, the plane flew a total of 16 hours and 22 minutes, including 10 takeoffs, 69 approaches, and 13 landings. August 1997. The cover of FEMA's Emergency Response to Terrorism depicts the World Trade Center in crosshairs. February 28, 1998. The Global Hawk, Raytheon's unmanned aircraft vehicle, completes its first flight over Edwards Air Force Base in California, at an altitude of 32,000 feet, cruising altitude for a commercial jetliner. 1999. NORAD begins conducting exercises in which hijacked airliners are flown into the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. June 2000. The Department of Justice releases a terrorism manual with the World Trade Center in crosshairs. September 2000. The Project for a New American Century, a neo-conservative think tank whose members include Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, Jeb Bush, and Paul Wolfowitz, releases their report, entitled Rebuilding America's Defenses. In it, they declare that the process of transformation, even if it brings revolutionary change, is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor. October 24th, 2000. The Pentagon conducts the first of two training exercises called Moscow, which simulate a Boeing 757 crashing into the building. Charles Burlingame, an ex-Navy F-4 pilot who worked in the Pentagon, participates in this exercise before retiring to take a job at American Airlines, where, less than a year later, his Boeing 757 allegedly crashes into the building. April 2001. NORAD plans an exercise in which a plane is flown into the Pentagon, but is rejected as too unrealistic. June 2001. The Department of Defense initiates new instructions for military intervention in the case of a hijacking. It states that for all non-immediate responses, the Department of Defense must get permission directly from the Secretary of Defense. Attorney General John Ashcroft begins flying on chartered jets for the remainder of his term due to a threat assessment by the FBI. July 4th, 2001. Osama bin Laden, wanted by the United States since 1998, receives medical attention at the American hospital in Dubai, where he is visited by a local chief of the CIA. July 24th, 2001. Larry A. Silverstein, who already owned World Trade Center 7, signs a $3.2 billion 99-year lease on the entire World Trade Center complex 6 weeks before 9/11. Included in the lease is a $3.5 billion insurance policy, specifically covering acts of terrorism. September 6, 2001, 3,150 put options are placed on United Airlines stock. A put option is a bet that a stock will fall. That day, put options were more than 4 times its daily average. Bomb-sniffing dogs are pulled from the World Trade Center, and security guards end 2 weeks of 12-hour shifts. September 7th, 2001. 27,294 put options are placed on Boeing stock, more than 5 times the daily average. September 10th, 2001. 4,516 put options are placed on American Airlines, almost 11 times its daily average. Newsweek reports that a number of top Pentagon brass canceled their flight plans for the next morning. San Francisco Mayor Willie Brown receives a phone call warning him not to fly the next morning. Pacifica Radio later reveals that this phone call came directly from National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice. And in Pakistan, at a military hospital, all of the urologists are replaced by a special team in order to host their guest of honor, Osama bin Laden, who is carefully escorted inside to be watched carefully and looked after. September 11th, 2001. The National Reconnaissance Office in Chantilly, Virginia is preparing for an exercise in which a small corporate jet crashes into their building. NORAD is in the middle of a number of military exercises. The first, Vigilant Guardian, is described as an exercise that would pose an imaginary crisis to North American air defense outposts nationwide. The second, Northern Vigilance, moved fighter jets to Canada and Alaska to fight off an imaginary Russian fleet. 3 F-16s from Washington, D.C.'s National Guard at Andrews Air Force Base, 15 miles from the Pentagon, are flown 180 nautical miles away for a training mission in North Carolina. This left 14 fighter jets to protect the entire United States.
Hi, Boston Center, Team U. We have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York, and we need you guys we need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise?
No, this is not an exercise, manifest. Do we want to think about scrambling aircraft? Oh, God, I don't know. That's a decision somebody's going to have to make probably in the next 10 minutes. Everybody just left the room.
The first question I have is basically to get from you a sense of how you would rate the American media in their coverage of the events of the attack last September.
Well, let's see. Shamefully is a word that comes to mind.
This just in, you are looking at obviously a very disturbing live shot there. That is the World Trade Center, and we have unconfirmed reports this morning that a plane has crashed into one of the towers of the World Trade Center.
But overall, the American journalism was cowed and intimidated by this massive flag sucking, this patriotic orgy. If you criticize the president, it's unpatriotic, and there's something wrong with you, you may be a terrorist.
So in that sense, Hunter S. Thompson, there's not enough room for dissenting voices?
Well, there's plenty of room. There's just not enough people are willing to take the risk.
Jim, I don't know whether we've confirmed that this was an air crash, or to be more specific, some people said they thought they saw a missile.
There was definitely a blue logo. It was like a circular logo on the front of the plane. It definitely did not look like a commercial plane. I didn't see any windows on the side.
Mark, if what you say is true, those could be cargo planes. You said you didn't see any windows in the side?
I didn't see any windows on the side. It was not a normal flight that I've ever seen at an airport. It was a plane that had a blue logo on the front, and it did not look like it belonged in this area.
It's just sort of a herd mentality, a lemming-like mentality. If you don't go with the flow, you're anti-American and therefore a suspect.
But again, that's not to imply that we have any reason at this point to believe that this is terrorism or not. We simply don't know. And in just a few minutes, Peter Jennings is going to be joining us from the news desk uptown, where he's going to tell us everything that he knows. We also have Don Daler on the phone, and he's been with us on Good Morning America for a long time. And Don, where are you, and what do you know?
I'm about 4 or 5 blocks just north of the World Trade Center, and at about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, there was a loud sound that I can only describe as it sounded like a missile, not an airplane. Then there was a loud explosion, and immediately lots of screaming out on the streets. And I don't want to cause any speculation, but that's the only way I could describe the sound, and it was definitely not the sound of a prop plane or anything like that.
And am I right? Are you a pilot?
Well, I have flown. I do not have a pilot's license, but I grew up on military bases, and I know the sound of jets, and I've been in war zones and heard those kinds of different sounds. So, again, not to cause any kind of undue speculation, but the sound itself was not of a prop plane. It was perhaps a jet, but it could have been a missile as well.
Can you give me, was it a whining sound, Don, or what?
Yes, it was a how to describe it? It was a high-pitched, but it had a whooshing sound, not like a prop plane.
Huh. And you didn't see...
Ben Fountain, a financial analyst who worked in the World Trade Center, told People magazine that in the weeks before 9/11, there were a number of unannounced and unusual drills where sections of both the Twin Towers and Building 7 were evacuated for security reasons. Daria Cord, a guard in the North Tower, told Newsday that security detail was working 12-hour shifts for 2 weeks before 9/11, but on Thursday the 6th, bomb-sniffing dogs were abruptly removed from the building. So who authorized all this? President Bush's brother, Marvin, was board of directors at Securicom from 1993 until fiscal year 2000. Securicom, now known as Stratasec, is an electronic security company backed by Kuwait American Corporation, which provided security for United Airlines, Dulles International Airport, and from the early 1990s up to the day of 9/11, the World Trade Center. Marvin is also the former director at HCC Insurance Holdings, which insured parts of the World Trade Center on 9/11. More information on this was supposed to be disclosed and never was. To date, the SEC has not revealed what they have learned. If only we could examine the debris from the World Trade Center and figure out what happened. Unfortunately, Mayor Giuliani began shipping the remains off to recycling yards overseas before investigators could even examine it. Not even FEMA was allowed into Ground Zero. Essentially, they blocked off a crime scene and destroyed all the evidence. Guess who was allowed into the site? Controlled Demolition, who was also responsible for cleaning up after the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. It gets better than that. On July 15, 2001, Controlled Demolition destroyed 2 400-foot-tall fuel reserve tanks from the World War II era. The demolition was conducted for no apparent reason and drew numerous complaints from the neighborhood. The site remains vacant to this day, and a reason for the demolition has never been disclosed. Regardless, I think what happened to the World Trade Center is simple enough. It was brought down in a carefully planned, controlled demolition. It was a psychological attack on the American people, and it was pulled off with military precision.
Insurance policies covered nearly everything in the World Trade Center that was destroyed. But what if certain commodities could be removed in the nick of time? Gold and silver held by commercial banks and the COMEX exchange is said to have been stored beneath Ground Zero. This single cache belonging to the Bank of Nova Scotia was unearthed and made public. Was there more, and was it removed, remains a question. As last survivor William Rodriguez climbed the stairwell to rescue people, he remembers a very strange thing.
As I stood there on the 33rd floor, I heard very strange noises on the 34th floor. Now, the 34th floor was an empty floor, a floor that did not have any kind of walls, or it was a construction floor. It was totally hollowed out. There was nothing there, and I heard very heavy equipment being moved around, and it sounded like dumpsters with metal wheels being moved around, and I got scared because I knew it was an empty floor. Nobody was supposed to be there. As a matter of fact, not even the elevators stopped there. You have to have a special access key to open the door on the 34th floor. So to find that there was strange noises there, and I continue actually bypassing that floor because I didn't dare to open the door on the 34th floor.
Something told William Rodriguez not to mess with the 34th floor. I got scared. Yet William Rodriguez was not a man who was scared that day. He remained in a burning building against firemen's orders, endangering his own life as he saved the lives of others. What could have been happening on the 34th floor? For weeks, Scott Forbes had heard similar noises on the 98th floor above him.
It must have been at least 4 to 6 weeks before 9/11. It was like rebuilding work going on upstairs. The tenants, the people from Aon who had been there were moved somewhere else. The offices were just vacant. And there was a lot of heavy machinery building work going on. It was almost like pneumatic drills and lots of hammering, so much so that the floors were shaking. That's how noticeable it was. It was almost as if something heavy was being moved and then it was being taken off wheels, and it was like boom. Our floor underneath literally shook. You could feel the weight above you. That was how large it was. On one occasion, I opened a door to see what was going on, being nosy. When I opened the door, the whole office space was empty. There was nothing there at all. It was quite bizarre, because it was just empty. Completely empty, barren, nothing, zero. Not even cables hanging from the ceiling, but there'd been these heavy noises and vibrations up above. It was really strange.
And the noticeable dust in the building the week before.
It was probably the week leading up to 9/11. Every morning I'd come in around 7 a.m. and the dust was incredible. It was filthy. It was like the cleaners weren't cleaning. Right where the windows were, there was a sill which enclosed radiators. I was sick to death of the dust which was appearing on the windowsills. It was dirty grey and very, very noticeable in that week leading up to 9/11. Where was that dust coming from?
Grey dust Scott himself had to clean. Was it powdered cement? The steel columns of the Twin Towers formed an endo and exoskeleton. Had something been placed around the edge of the building, holes been drilled to contain it? Was the dust in those final days a telltale sign? As white elephants, the buildings were full of vacant offices. Tenants could be temporarily moved around for upgrades as Aon was, and a plan arranged to perfection. Was the strange construction that could be heard but not seen going on all over the towers? Larry Silverstein took possession 6 weeks before September 11th, when the strange construction began. Were the sounds that scared William Rodriguez the last of the rats as they left a sinking ship? Who was a director in the company that provided electronic security for the World Trade Center and Washington's Dulles Airport, both involved in September 11th? None other than the president's younger brother. From 1996 to 2000, Securicom installed what was referred to as a new security system at the World Trade Center. Wirt D. Walker III, a cousin of the Bush brothers, was CEO of Securicom from 1999 until 2002. Interestingly, these facts have not been made public. Was it only a security system that was added during those years, or was it also the wiring for a long-awaited plan? Scott Forbes, an IT specialist in a firm that had leased space in the South Tower since its erection, reported an unprecedented power down in his building for almost the whole weekend prior to 9/11.
We were notified 3 weeks in advance of the power down by the Port Authority. That was relatively short notice to plan to shut down all of our banking systems. It was a big deal. It was unprecedented. We had a data center on the 97th floor. So our originating servers were all there. During that weekend, the power down meant that there was no security. The doors were all open, basically. And also the security video cameras were all off. But they were guys in overalls carrying huge toolboxes and reels of cables walking around the building on that weekend.
Employees were notified that internet cables were being upgraded. But who were the strange workmen, and what were they really doing?
All the power was shut down. If there was a power down, that meant that everything was gone in terms of security, in terms of access to the building. So anybody could have gone there and do any kind of setup.
Having worked overtime to get his company's servers back up, Scott took the day off on September 11th. As he watched the towers collapse from New Jersey that morning, he was sure this had been the purpose of the mysterious weekend work. Scott notified many authorities, including the 9/11 Commission, about the unusual and lengthy power outage, but was ignored. Ben Fountain of Fireman's Fund spoke of unusual evacuations ordered at the Twin Towers during the weeks before September 11th. Others reported that the security alert was inexplicably lifted 5 days prior, and bomb-sniffing dogs were removed. What would the dogs have discovered had they remained on duty?
Para la mayoría de los estadounidenses, el 11 de septiembre fue una terrible tragedia. Para George Bush y Dick Cheney también, pero además fue la oportunidad de llevar a cabo los planes que sus aliados neoconservadores llevaban décadas trazando. En un informe del año 2000 del Proyecto para el Nuevo Siglo Americano, llamado Reconstruir las Defensas de América, se decía: el proceso de transformación será probablemente largo, de no producirse un evento catastrófico y catalizador como un nuevo Pearl Harbor. Y pocos minutos después del ataque, el equipo de Bush entró en acción. Con Bush en Florida, el vicepresidente Cheney y su asesor legal David Addington tomaron el mando, argumentando que el presidente, como comandante en jefe en tiempos de guerra, podía actuar en la práctica fuera de los límites de la ley.
The two towers shake considerably with the first impact, but they immediately return to their original structural position. Why? Because they were specifically designed to do this in the event of a plane crash.
Towers were very solidly built. It's like a tree. You see, when you bend a tree, you have all these fibers in the tree, but they're interconnected. So when the tree bends, it can handle that motion.
Para las dos torres se usaron 200,000 toneladas de acero reforzado. El acero de las Torres Gemelas no era un acero común y corriente. Este acero cumplía con la norma internacional E119, es decir, era un acero a prueba de fuego, pudiendo soportar temperaturas de hasta 1100 grados centígrados por varias horas sin verse afectado. El núcleo de cada torre era una sólida estructura de 1000 metros cuadrados, con 47 fuertes columnas de acero. Estos núcleos eran literalmente un edificio dentro de otro edificio, conteniendo los 97 elevadores que daban servicio a cada torre, y soportando, junto con las paredes exteriores, todos los pisos de las torres. No eran estructuras huecas y débiles, incapaces de soportar impactos e incendios como los del 11 de septiembre. Incluso se consideraron posibles impactos de aviones durante su diseño y construcción, como explica Frank De Martini, gerente de construcción de las Torres Gemelas.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
Il primo elemento a mettere in dubbio la versione ufficiale è che le torri stesse erano state progettate per reggere con ampio margine all'eventuale impatto di un grosso aereo di linea con conseguente incendio. I calcoli erano stati fatti su un Boeing 707, l'aereo più grande che ci fosse in circolazione in quegli anni. Il suo peso, le dimensioni e il carico di carburante erano molto simili a quelli dei Boeing 767 che hanno colpito le torri l'11 di settembre. Leslie Robertson era il progettista responsabile della robustezza strutturale delle torri.
The airplane we were envisioning was the largest airplane of its time. We designed the buildings to take the impact of the Boeing 707 hitting the building at any location.
On July 28, 1945, a B-52 bomber lost in the fog crashed into the 79th floor of the Empire State Building. 14 people dead, $1 million in damage, but the building stands intact to this day. On February 14, 1975, a 3-alarm fire broke out between the 9th and 14th floors of the North Tower. According to the New York Times, the fire leads to intense scrutiny of the towers and eventually to a decision to install sprinklers. On May 4, 1988, a 62-story skyscraper in Los Angeles burned for 3 hours and spread over 4 floors. It did not collapse. On February 23, 1991, a 38-story skyscraper in Philadelphia, built in 1973, burned for more than 19 hours and spread over 8 floors. It did not collapse. On October 17, 2004, a 56-story skyscraper in Venezuela, built in 1976, burned for over 17 hours and spread over 26 floors, eventually reaching the roof. Guess what? It did not collapse. On February 12, 2005, the Windsor Building in Madrid, a 32-story tower framed in steel-reinforced concrete, burned for almost 24 hours, completely eradicating the upper 10 stories of the building. Although the top 10 floors of the building fell, the building itself did not collapse. And yet, on September 11, 2001, two 110-story skyscrapers, completed in 1973, burned for 56 and 103 minutes, respectively, over 4 floors, before collapsing completely to the ground.
Una conferma ci arriva da questa immagine termografica, scattata mentre la torre sud era in fiamme da una professionista del settore. Dopo l'impatto dell'aereo, avvenuto alle 9:02, la maggior parte del carburante era fuoriuscita prima di esplodere, creando la palla di fuoco che tutti ricordiamo. La foto è scattata alle 9:18. È quindi passato un solo quarto d'ora dall'impatto, e già si vede come non ci sia una sola zona della torre che superi i 100 gradi di temperatura. Siamo distanti anni luce dalle temperature che sarebbero necessarie ad ammorbidire le strutture portanti delle torri.
As far as 9/11 is concerned, what is most important for you to understand is the concept of a law of nature. A law of nature cannot be violated, a law of nature cannot be changed, a law of nature requires no enforcement. It turns out that steel has a melting point of 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The steel used in these buildings was certified by Underwriters Laboratory to 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit for up to 6 hours. 6 hours. The highest temperature at which kerosene based jet fuel can burn under optimal conditions is around 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. Underwriters Laboratory actually estimated that because of the insulation and so forth in the building, that it was far more likely that the steel itself was never heated much above around 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which of course is obviously far too low to accommodate the melting of the steel.
Jonathan Barnett è un ingegnere specializzato nella protezione degli edifici dal fuoco.
In fact, the fires, normal fires, are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. In over 20 years, I have not seen a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
See the plumes coming off the side. That doesn't take a lot of explosives.
Lo conferma Stephen Jones, uno dei tanti accademici americani ad aver contestato pubblicamente la tesi dei cedimenti strutturali.
There must be other examples if fires brought these buildings down. There were no examples. The probability that one of these buildings would come down due to fire, I mean, just looking at other buildings that have had fires and haven't collapsed, of which there are hundreds of examples. So your probability is already 1 in perhaps 400 or 500. 3 buildings on the same day, I mean, just that one statistic, well, it's 400 times 400 times 400. It's just a very small number already, the probability. And then for it to come down symmetrically. Yeah? I mean, again, the probability for that is more likely it will tip over. See? So that's the more likely. So what's the probability that somehow all three buildings come straight down?
Never before or after 9/11 have steel frame towers collapsed due to fire.
In 2005, there was a fearsome conflagration in Madrid. A skyscraper went up in flames. It was a huge torch that kept burning for 20 hours. 20 consecutive hours. But in the end, the load-bearing structure remained intact. The skyscraper did not fall down. As you can see, the building is enveloped in flames. This skyscraper was not yet complete. It was still under construction. Nevertheless, it remained standing. Something you should note is the white color of the flames. This means that there is a lot of oxygen burning. If you look at the flames coming from the two towers in New York, we can see instead that the flames are dark red and the smoke is black.
The fires that were burning in these towers was a dark gray, a heavy, almost black gray smoke coming off. This implies an oxygen-starved fire.
Nevertheless, 55 minutes later, the whole tower collapses. According to the official NIST version of events, at a certain point, the steel structure of the towers gave way. It no longer had the structural strength that it had at the beginning. And all of this was supposed to be because of the immense heat. And here is something difficult to explain. We know that at some point certain people managed to walk down from the top of this tower and cross the point where the fire was strongest. Somehow they reached the bottom of the tower. How did they manage to do that?
I don't know. When I looked down there, I didn't see flames. I just sensed that it was the right thing to go and try and test it. We would go as far as we could until we were stopped by flames. And when we came to the 78th floor, the last layer was standing, but it was cracked. And there were flames licking up the other side of the wall like this. It wasn't a roaring inferno. I sensed that the flames were maybe starved for oxygen right there, you know, in the interior. We kept going, and we got onto the 74th floor. When we got down that far, normal conditions. The lights were on, fresh air coming up from below.
So the temperature inside the building was not particularly high, as we can see from the presence of this woman who is standing at the precise point where the plane impacted.
Ma l'ostacolo più grosso di tutti per accettare la tesi dei crolli strutturali è una notevole quantità di testimonianze, poliziotti, pompieri, giornalisti e comuni passanti, che hanno sentito o hanno vissuto in prima persona una lunga serie di esplosioni alla base delle torri, qualche secondo prima o durante i crolli stessi.
Everybody talks about what the new Trade Center is going to look like, but I'm telling you right now, the old Trade Center was the most beautiful thing in the world.
For 7 years, 37-year-old Philip Morelli was a construction worker inside the Trade Center. The Queens native says he loved his job at the Twin Towers. At 8:30, he says he was headed to level B4 in Tower 1, 4 stories below ground.
I go downstairs, the foreman tells me to go to remove the containers. As I'm walking by the main freight car of the building in the corridor, that's when I got blown. I mean, the impact of the explosion, of whatever happened, it threw me to the floor, and that's when everything started happening. I was racing, I was going towards the bathroom. All of a sudden, I opened the door, I didn't know it was a bathroom, and all of a sudden a big impact happened again. And all the ceiling tile was falling down, the light fixtures were falling, swinging out of the ceiling. I mean, I know of people that got killed in the basement. I know of people that got broken legs in the basement. People that got reconstructive surgery because the walls hit them in the face.
There were 2 or 3 similar huge explosions, and the building literally shook. You literally shook at the base of this building.
Just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt, we heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse. And to me, it sounded like an explosion. Then the building, the rolling sound sounded like the building collapsed.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble. Cars on fire, cars just turned by the force of the explosion.
We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
Trying to get some of the people out, then there saw secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
All of a sudden, it started like it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 and then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted, whether in fact there wasn't something else at the base of the towers that in fact were the coup de grace to bring them to the ground.
That would put us about a block and a half away from the site of where the explosion was. That area has just been evacuated because police have found what they describe as a suspicious device, and they fear that it might be something that could lead to another explosion.
I got an eyewitness who said there was an explosion on floor 7-8. 7-8. Dispatch, we just had another explosion.
Warren Street because of the secondary explosion. We've got numerous people covered with dust from the secondary explosion.
And we got another explosion on the tower, 1013. 1013, there 2 has had a major explosion and what appears to be a complete collapse surrounding the entire area. Who's involved in the secondary explosion at Tower 1 camp?
Moments ago, I spoke to the Chief of Safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off, but he said that there was another explosion which took place, and then an hour after the first hit here, there was another explosion that took place. He thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building. We are continuing to hear explosions here.
It turned out that literally dozens of firefighters and emergency medical workers had given testimony that they had heard 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, some said 10 explosions going off in the building. Some of the people in the buildings reported that they were banged around and knocked downstairs by explosions. Other people testified to seeing flashes, and many of them said it looked just like on TV when we see them bring down buildings with explosions. We saw the flashes, we saw the demolition rings, we heard the sounds.
I worked there for 20 years and I was a janitor, the person that cleaned all the floors. The building has 6 up-levels of basement. The support companies for the cleaning of the World Trade Center were located on Big 1. While I was there at 8:46, all of a sudden we hear boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us up. When I went to verbalize it, like 6 seconds after, we hear that boom, that impact all the way on the top. So 2 different events, and at that very moment when I said, oh my God, a guy comes running into the office, and this guy had his hands extended, both arms like this, and his skin was pulled totally from both arms, and it was hanging from the top of the fingertips like it was clothing. And I thought at that time that it was clothing. And when I went to say something, I realized, I look at his face, I realized that he had missing parts of his face.
He had, on that particular day, the only master key. He went up with the master key, unlocking door after door so firemen could get in, and he himself, I think he said, brought out 15 or 20 people.
So I started opening the doors of the stairwells so people could escape.
Willie was made a hero, and he was at the White House. And we have a picture of that, of George Bush honoring Willie Rodriguez for being a hero.
We hear boom, 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 different explosions. And I asked the fire department, I said, what is this explosion? And what they said was, maybe it's the gas tank from the kitchen. No! The kitchens were all electrical, so that didn't make any sense.
I heard a loud explosion, an explosion that I had never heard in my whole life, an enormous explosion.
My ears were hearing loud explosions at ground level, very mysterious. Explosions that seemed to be at ground level as opposed to high in the air.
There's no question in my mind that those buildings, based on the law of physics, could not have collapsed without the assistance of a bomb.
No! When I hear another explosion, no! I think it's a bomb.
Willie has taken the really 180% turn of events, saying here that President Bush, who had honored him being a hero, he's named on this lawsuit as accusing Bush and Cheney and Senior Bush and others of murder. And he's not doing it for any monetary gain, because this has just cost us everything. Willie has lost his home, lost his job. Right now, his goal is to find out the truth.
and we started running, floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was like, it was if they had detonated.
Detonated.
If they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
As we were moving towards the building, we saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
And you can see that it almost looks like one of those planned implosions.
It's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
Managed implosion of the building. If you've seen many of the managed demolitions where they implode a building and they cause it essentially to fall vertically because they cause all of the vertical columns to fail simultaneously. That's exactly what it looked like, and that's what happened.
It was live on television. I mean, just literally millions of people.
Un altro fatto inspiegabile è la velocità impressionante di caduta dei 3 edifici. Circa 10 secondi per le torri, più di 100 piani per 400 metri ciascuna, e 6 secondi per l'edificio numero 7, 40 piani per circa 150 metri di altezza. Le 3 torri sono cadute praticamente nello stesso tempo che avrebbe impiegato a raggiungere il suolo una sfera d'acciaio lasciata cadere dal tetto dell'edificio al momento dell'inizio del crollo. Ma questo contraddice uno dei più noti principi della fisica, secondo il quale invece i vari piani, cadendo l'uno sull'altro, avrebbero dovuto accumulare un ritardo progressivo, risultando in un tempo totale di caduta molto superiore a quello della sfera lanciata nel vuoto.
I mentioned Galileo's law of free fall. If you had dropped, say, a billiard ball from the top of the World Trade Center, 110 floors up there, it would have taken 8 to 10 seconds to hit the ground, encountering no resistance whatsoever. There is no scenario for a pancake effect of buildings falling that allows them to fall at the rate of free fall. If you were just to surmise, hypothetically as an approximation, that they would take a second for each floor to collapse, and if you were talking about the whole 110 floors, that would represent 110 seconds, or 100 seconds too many. If you assume that, well, yeah, but the one hit on the 96th floor, so we're only talking about collapse from the 96th floor, that would still be 96 seconds if you're assuming a second per collapse per floor. Now, an engineer in California suggests that a second is too high, that it may have only taken a half a second in order for the mass, the weight of the upper floors to overcome the resistance of the lower floors, and suggests that a half a second. Well, if you take a half a second into 96 floors, then you get 48 seconds it should have taken for the building to fall. Yet they only fell in 8 to 10 seconds, far too fast.
Stephen Jones says, not so fast.
They're sticking with this one hypothesis. It's almost they have blinders on. It's got to be fires and damage.
Jones is a 20-year physics professor at BYU.
Symmetrically now, it doesn't topple over as you might expect from what we call the second law of thermodynamics. It comes straight down. This is the goal of pre-positioned explosives in a controlled demolition.
Nelle demolizioni controllate, gli esplosivi vanno piazzati con molta cura e dopo lunghi calcoli. Bisogna fare in modo che le cariche piazzate alla base dei piloni centrali, esplodendo un istante prima delle altre, portino con sé il resto della struttura senza danneggiare gli edifici circostanti. Per garantire che questo accada, le esplosioni alla base devono essere molto potenti e di solito generano un calore tale che nel punto in cui erano conficcati i piloni si vengono a formare delle vere e proprie pozze di acciaio fuso, mentre le macerie tutte intorno continuano a ribollire per lungo tempo. Questo invece non dovrebbe accadere nel caso che un edificio crolli per un semplice cedimento strutturale. Questa immagine termografica, scattata dal satellite 5 giorni dopo i crolli delle torri, ritrae la zona del World Trade Center Plaza. I punti più caldi sono proprio alla base delle 3 torri crollate. Queste immagini di New York sono state riprese dallo shuttle 2 settimane dopo i crolli. In un cielo completamente terso si vede chiaramente la lunga nuvola di fumo che per molte settimane ha continuato a fuoriuscire dalle macerie delle torri crollate.
Today is November 1st, and if you think about it, the smoke at this very moment is still rising out of the World Trade Center.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it was just a bright, bright reddish orange color.
One of the things that particularly struck me was the incredible speed with which the towers came down. There was something truly inexplicable about the speed of the collapse. If we dropped a weight from a height of around 400 meters, which was the height of the towers, the time it would take to reach the ground, supposing that there was not even any air resistance to slow down the speed of the fall, would take approximately 9 seconds.
Took about 8 or 10 seconds for the whole tower just to go straight down.
The impact was at about 2/3 of the way up the tower. Even if the section above collapsed suddenly due to the structure giving way, and even considering that the impact of the section above was enormous and therefore in some way weakened the resistance of the structures below, it is clear that, due to the resistance of the undamaged part below, this tower should not have fallen at such a speed. But it fell as if there was nothing below it, whereas there was an enormous structure below, a resistant structure that should have slowed down the speed of the collapse considerably. Here, close to the 2 towers, there was another large tower, which was hit by the debris from the tower that collapsed.
This building, this huge, it was this 47-story building, was never hit by a jet. And yet it came down that same day, but 7 hours after the last tower fell, 7 hours later. Measure the time of fall. The fall is almost free fall speed.
The collapse of the North Tower inflicts some damage to Building 7, causing fires to ignite on a few floors. Even the official version admits that fire has a low probability of causing the collapse. But why does total collapse take place? And why does it occur at freefall speed?
As I saw the collapse of World Trade Center 7, I realized this was something that needed to be studied and could not be ignored.
Un altro fatto inspiegabile rimane per tutte e tre le torri la completa polverizzazione dell'intero edificio. Nei normali crolli il cemento si spezza in svariati blocchi, che però rimangono interi e ben riconoscibili l'uno dall'altro.
This was the South Tower. This was 104, 106 stories tall. This is what is left. Up there was the North Tower. And you look, and you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. What happened to the concrete? The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized.
La versione ufficiale vuole che siano stati i piani dell'edificio, cadendo uno sull'altro, a causare il crollo delle torri. Ma in questo caso, da dove viene la forza che scaglia quintali e quintali di calcinacci a una distanza quasi doppia della larghezza della torre e addirittura verso l'alto? Che cosa può essere in grado di tranciare di netto dei pezzi di struttura esterna come questo, scagliandoli a conficcarsi addirittura negli edifici antistanti? David Childs è un noto architetto di New York che partecipa al progetto di ricostruzione delle torri.
Well, I was shocked when they fell down, quite frankly. And in fact, these kinds of designs have performed extraordinarily well over history. In fact, until this occurrence, no building had fallen down because of fire. There have been major fires and a couple of floors had fallen down or whatever, but the steel structure is a very efficient and safe structure, particularly this kind of core design.
E infatti, se anche i piani fossero caduti l'uno sull'altro, ci si aspetterebbe di vedere i piloni della struttura centrale rimanere in piedi, nonostante il crollo del resto dell'edificio. Questo invece non è accaduto. Ambedue le torri si sono dissolte in polvere e dei piloni centrali non è rimasto più nulla.
You have 210-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
A volcano.
The U.S. Geological Survey website provides us with a definition of a pyroclastic flow as a ground-hugging avalanche of hot gas and debris. The rising gas chimney is clearly visible in this photo of the North Tower implosion with pyroclastic flows between buildings. The cauliflower shape of the debris clouds is a telltale sign of pyroclastic flows generated by massive explosions typical of volcanic eruptions and controlled demolitions.
Next, what about the cell phone calls? For starters, the calls themselves are extremely peculiar. Most of them are only a couple sentences long before the callers end the conversation, only to call back later. Flight attendant Betty Ong allegedly placed a call from Flight 11, according to the 9/11 Commission. Although the conversation lasted 23 minutes, only 4.5 minutes was recorded.
What is your name? Okay, my name is Betty Ong. I'm number 3 on Flight 11. Okay. And the cockpit is not answering their phone. And there's somebody strapped in business class, and there's We can't breathe in business class. Somebody's got mace or something. Okay, our number one got stabbed. Our purser is stabbed. Nobody knows who stabbed who, and we can't even get up to business class right now because nobody can breathe. Our number one is stabbed right now. Okay. And our number five, our first class passengers, our first class galley flight attendant and our purser has been stabbed. And we can't get the cockpit. The door won't open.
Does Miss Ong sound like a woman on a hijacked plane who just saw 3 people murdered? Why is nobody in the background screaming? Flight attendant Madeline Sweeney allegedly talked with the ground manager Michael Woodward for 25 minutes. She describes 4 hijackers. The FBI says there were 5. She says the hijackers were in rows 9 and 10. The FAA says they were all in row 8. Near the end, she screams, "I see buildings. Water. Oh my God." Madeline was a flight attendant out of Boston for 12 years. I think she would have recognized Manhattan. A man claiming to be Mark Bingham called his mother Alice, who is visiting his sister-in-law. The caller says, "Mom, this is Mark Bingham. When was the last time you called your mother and used your full name? I just want to tell you that I love you. I'm on a flight from Newark to San Francisco, and there are 3 guys on board, and they say they've taken over the plane, and they say they have a bomb. I'm calling you from the airphone." And then, "You believe me, don't you, Mom?" "Yes, Mark, I believe you. Who are these guys?" Then he was interrupted by someone who was speaking in a low-toned male voice, speaking what sounded like English. After 30 seconds of muffled sounds, the caller repeats, "I'm calling you with an airphone." His mother asks him again, "Who are these guys?" After another pause, he returns and asks again, "You believe me, don't you, Mom?" There was another pause, and the phone just trailed off. To date, none of these calls, except for Betty Ong's call to American Airlines, has been released to the public. But to be honest, none of that matters. Why? Because none of these calls could have taken place. Key Dudney of Physics911.net conducted some research of his own. In an experiment called Project Achilles, he took a series of cell phones onto a Cessna 172 and flew up to 8,000 feet to determine the success rate as the plane got higher. At 4,000 feet, he had a 0.4 success rate. At 8,000 feet, he had a 0.1 success rate. For 32,000 feet, cruising altitude for a commercial airliner, he calculated a 0.006 success rate, less than 1 in 100th of a chance. Don't believe me? Even American Airlines has put their foot in the government's mouth. On July 15th, 2004, passengers aboard a commercial American Airlines flight were able to send and receive calls from their cell phones as if they were on the ground, thanks to a cell station that was installed into the plane. It worked great. I called the office, I called my wife, I called a friend in Paris. They all heard me great, and I could hear them loud and clear. Why would American Airlines spend thousands of dollars on this technology in 2004 when cell phones worked so well on September 11th, 2001? So how is it possible to fake a person's voice? In 1999, the Los Alamos Laboratory in New Mexico revealed their voice morphing technology. General Carl W. Steiner, the former Commander-in-Chief of United States Special Operations, declared on tape, "Gentlemen, we have called you together to inform you that we are going to overthrow the United States government." Another example was Colin Powell, saying, "I am being treated well by my captors." With just a 10-minute recording of somebody's voice, they are able, in almost real time, to clone someone's speech. Steiner was so impressed, he asked for a copy.
According to standard operating procedure, if an FAA flight controller notices anything that suggests a possible hijacking, the controller is to contact a superior. If the problem cannot be fixed within about a minute, the superior is to ask NORAD, the North American Aerospace Command, to send up or scramble jet fighters to find out what is going on. NORAD then issues a scramble order to the nearest Air Force base with fighters on alert. But although interceptions usually occur within 10 or so minutes, in this case, 80 or so minutes had elapsed before fighters were even airborne.
It's a mind-bending anomaly. Not a single U.S. Air Force interceptor turns a wheel until it's too late. There are no jets at all.
What if they were so confused and had been so deliberately confused that they couldn't respond? The reason that they didn't know where to go was because a number of conflicting and overlapping war game exercises were taking place. It involved the insertion of false radar blips onto radar screens in the Northeast Air Defense Sector.
Lieutenant Team U, we have a problem here. We have a hijacked aircraft headed towards New York. We need someone to scramble some F-16s or something up there to help us out.
Is this real world or exercise? Is this real world or exercise? There was another exercise, Vigilant Warrior, which was in fact, according to a NORAD source, a live-fly hijack drill being conducted at the same time. With only 8 available fighter aircraft, and they have to be dispatched in pairs, they were dealing with as many as 22 possible hijacks on the day of 9/11, and they couldn't separate the war game exercises from the actual hijacks.
El martes 11 de septiembre del 2001 se llevó a cabo el ataque más audaz y sangriento en suelo americano de la historia, ejecutado supuestamente por 19 terroristas coordinados desde una cueva en Afganistán. Significativamente, varios ejercicios militares y por lo menos una operación militar habían sido programados para la semana de los ataques. Y curiosamente, en mayo del 2001, el presidente Bush entregó el control de todos los ejercicios militares al vicepresidente Dick Cheney. Bajo el control de Cheney, el 11 de septiembre se desarrollaban Vigilant Warrior. Este ejercicio implicaba por lo menos un avión comercial real en el aire simulando ser secuestrado. Vigilant Guardian era una guerra aérea simulada. Se fingía un ataque aéreo a los Estados Unidos. Global Guardian era un ejercicio para probar la capacidad de respuesta a un ataque nuclear. Tripod 2 era una simulación de ataque bioquímico y estaba programado para comenzar el 12 de septiembre en Nueva York. El lunes 10 ya había llegado a Manhattan el personal de la Agencia Federal para Manejo de Emergencias, FEMA. Instalaron su base en el Muelle 29, la que el día siguiente se convertiría, convenientemente, en el centro de respuesta a los ataques a las Torres Gemelas. Northern Vigilance. Esta era una operación militar que consistía en desplegar cazas en Canadá y Alaska para monitorear un ejercicio militar ruso. 2 de estos ejercicios, Vigilant Guardian y Vigilant Warrior, estaban dirigidos por el Comando de Defensa Aeroespacial, NORAD, la agencia encargada de proteger el espacio aéreo americano. Para estos ejercicios, NORAD usaba su capacidad de inyectar señales falsas en radares, simulando ataques en masa o supuestos aviones secuestrados, sin que el operador de radar pudiera distinguir la diferencia entre las señales falsas y las verdaderas. Así, el día en que 4 aviones serían secuestrados, las pantallas de radar de los controladores aéreos estaban llenas de aviones fantasma y confusión. Contrariamente a lo que se pudiera pensar, estos ejercicios no dejaron desprotegida a la costa este. A pesar de todos los recursos absorbidos por ellos, había suficientes aviones caza para poder realizar una defensa efectiva en caso de ataque. Si lo sucedido el 11 de septiembre no fue un ataque terrorista, sino una operación militar, todos estos ejercicios crearon la confusión e infraestructura para que los ataques se realizaran con éxito.
They do such a coordinated thing that the American literally disappeared and the United literally got hijacked at almost the same time. And I've always wondered if they were actually talking to each other, saying, "I'm going in now, good luck."
En la noche del martes 11 de septiembre, 6 controladores se reúnen en la Baticueva, la sala de juntas localizada en el sótano del Centro de Control de Nueva York. Cada uno toma el micrófono de una grabadora durante 5 o 10 minutos, registrando sus impresiones de lo sucedido en la mañana de ese día. Una vez terminada la junta, un oficial de la FAA se presenta, toma el cassette grabado y lo hace pedazos. El supuesto oficial argumenta que los controladores no tenían el estado mental adecuado para dar sus testimonios, debido al estrés de ese día, además de argumentar de forma ridícula que debió haber sido de forma escrita y no en una grabación.
Because at 9:30 this morning we were actually running an exercise for over a company of 1,000 people in London based on simultaneous bombs going off precisely at the railway stations that happened this morning. So I still have the hairs on the back of my neck standing upright.
To get this quite straight, you were running an exercise to see how you would cope with this, and it happened while you were running the exercise?
Precisely.
Supposed to believe is some kind of coincidence, there was also an anti-terrorist drill going on 7/7, and again, just like 9/11, they were talking about attacks on the same targets, the same kind of tube stations, and exactly the same time as the actual attack happened, providing some kind of cover for what must be operations orchestrated in some way by the state.
Peter Power, dupe or accomplice? Then, on 7/7/2005, we were told on TV by Peter Power of Visor Consultants that they, and the private company employing them, who helped choose the scenario for it, were running a mock terrorist drill in the London Underground, with practically the same scenario as what actually really happened on that day. In other words, the actual mock anti-terror drill that the BBC Panorama programme of May 2004 had outlined had been chosen by Visor's client to be carried out on the very same day that 4 Muslim suicide bombers also chose the same scenarios that Visor's client had chosen for the mock drill, causing real and devastating explosions on 3 London tube trains and 1 road vehicle. Please think about that unbelievable set of coincidences for a few seconds, to let the implications of it sink in. Then, please ask yourself, what are the odds against all of that happening by chance?
Just to get this right, you were actually working today on an exercise that envisioned virtually this scenario?
Almost precisely. I was up until 2 o'clock this morning because it's our job, my own company, Visor Consultants. We specialise in helping people to get their crisis management response. How do you jump from slow time thinking to quick time doing? And we chose a scenario with their assistance which is based on a terrorist attack because they're very close to a property occupied by Jewish businessmen. They're in the city, and there are more American banks in the city than there are in the whole of New York. A logical thing to do. And I've still got the...
I was going to say, how extraordinary today must feel for you as it unfolds.
In his TV video clip, Peter Power states that their customer helped to choose the exact scenario. I repeat, Visor's customer helped to choose the exact scenario. To this day, Peter Power refuses to publicly identify the customer who chose the exact scenario. Why? Third chapter title, Foreign Security Firms. Can they be trusted? Verint Systems is the security firm that is responsible for the CCTV surveillance cameras in the London Underground rail network, and it is an Israeli company with approximately 1,000 employees. No CCTV footage of the 4 Muslims boarding the tube trains has been released by Verint, who claim that their cameras were not working. Why? Because the 4 Muslims were not on the tube trains that blew up. 4th chapter title: The 4 Muslims, Actors or Patsies? We were also told that the training exercise involved 1,000 people and, of course, amongst those 1,000 people would have to be the 4 people who were recruited to play the parts of the mock terrorists. Therefore, as part of the exercise, they would have recruited 4 young Muslim men to carry 4 backpacks that were to contain mock explosive devices. Who were their Muslim recruits? These Muslim men would naturally buy return train tickets and not one-way tickets, because they would be going home after playing their parts in the training exercise. One of them, the oldest, who would be considered the ringleader of the group because of his age, would have been asked to make a suicide video prior to 7/7/2005, being told it would form part of the training mock terrorist exercise, in order to make the exercise, and possibly a film to be made of it, look as realistic as possible. He would obviously not have been told the details of the whole plan until later, probably when he and the others arrived at Luton on the 7th of July 2005, to make absolutely certain that the scenario of the drill which would take place that day could not be talked about by or to anyone. The second oldest would also be asked to make a similar video as a backup for just in case anything went wrong, and or the oldest pulled out of the drill before the 7th of July 2005. It should be noted that neither Mohammed Siddiqui Khan nor Shehzad Tanweer specify what their targets were in their videos. It is also interesting to note that no one has ever claimed responsibility for the 7/7/2005 bombings, except for a message on a fake Al-Qaeda website on the same day that was traced to Texas in the USA. Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli finance minister, said that he was warned by Scotland Yard not to leave his hotel room on the morning of 7/7/2005 before the first explosion was reported, implying that they had foreknowledge of the plan. Scotland Yard then quickly denied being the ones who had provided the warning, but have not told us who did warn Netanyahu if they did not. Why was Benjamin Netanyahu warned, but not the British people who pay their wages and whom they are paid to protect?
Por otro lado, el 1 de marzo de 2004, y solo un día después de la visita del secretario general de la OTAN al Estado español, esta organización publicó una nota de prensa en la que anunciaba que iba a realizar su ejercicio anual de gestión de crisis CMX del 4 al 10 de marzo de 2004 en diversas capitales de los Estados miembros. Una de ellas sería Madrid. El ejercicio consistiría en un simulacro de una operación antiterrorista en el que intervendrían multitud de personal militar y civil vinculado a la OTAN, que tendrían vía libre durante aquellos días para moverse por Madrid con toda clase de material militar, algo que llevaron a cabo con total impunidad y sin control alguno por parte de las autoridades locales. Al día siguiente de que la OTAN diera por finalizado su ejercicio antiterrorista, sucedía la tragedia.
Que los trenes del 11M fueron desguazados apenas 24 horas después de la masacre es algo que ya sabíamos. Que se hizo en contra de la ley de enjuiciamiento criminal que exige la conservación de las pruebas, también. Pero ahora el ingeniero Carlos Sánchez de Roda añade un detalle más. Al menos 90 toneladas de material desaparecieron sin dejar rastro. En estas fotografías correspondientes al vagón 5 de la calle Tellet podemos observar cómo se procedió a una meticulosa retirada de todos los restos próximos al foco de explosión, en muchos casos con presencia policial. Según los cálculos de Sánchez de Roda, la diferencia entre el peso de los trenes y el entregado finalmente al desguace revela que se guardaron 90 toneladas de restos, aproximadamente 9 correspondientes al coche de Tellet. La pregunta es sencilla: si de esas 9 toneladas lo único que se entregó al juez fue este clavo, ¿dónde está el resto?
El pasado 11 de marzo, sexto aniversario de la masacre del 11M, el rey recibió a las víctimas de las asociaciones que agrupan a los familiares de los muertos y a los heridos de esa masacre y les dedicó una hora de su tiempo, durante el cual las víctimas del 11M le hicieron llegar sus quejas sobre todo lo que rodea aquellos atentados. Se quejaron, por ejemplo, de la instrucción del 11M, se quejaron de la actitud del juez Juan del Olmo, de la fiscal Olga Sánchez, del juez Gómez Bermúdez, que presidió el tribunal del 11M. Y en un momento determinado las víctimas le manifestaron al rey sus sospechas de que el 11M no es lo que nos han contado, de que el 11M es un crimen de Estado, y le expresaron también su deseo de llegar a conocer toda la verdad de lo que pasó. Ante lo cual, Su Majestad pues les respondió unas palabras que les dejaron estupefactos. «Lo lleváis crudo», les dijo. «A mí todavía me ocultan cosas del 23F». La verdad es que las palabras del rey resultan enormemente impactantes, pero también resultan enormemente elocuentes, porque en realidad reflejan lo que muchos sospechamos que fue el 11M. Desde luego no fue un atentado terrorista, fue algo infinitamente más grave, y quizás eso explique tanto silencio como hay hoy en la clase política en torno a un tema del que parece que nadie quiere hablar, del que parece que nadie quiere remover por si acaso la porquería empieza a salpicar en todas direcciones.
Los servicios del Estado, bueno, pues mire usted, los servicios secretos del Estado han estado detrás de las guerras sucias. Me gustaría algún día ver qué relación puede haber con ETA, porque no es la primera vez que lo estoy diciendo aquí.
Le iba a preguntar por unas declaraciones suyas del 28 de febrero de 2004 en las que afirmaba: ETA está teledirigida por las cloacas del Estado.
Sí, lo afirmaba entonces y lo afirmo ahora. No totalmente, pero evidentemente tengo informaciones que en el caso que se me requiera judicialmente las canto, en donde, bueno, pues pues ha habido cosas raras, extrañas. Yo no puedo entender cómo un Estado como el español, en magnífica relación con el Estado francés en estos momentos, no se haya llegado hasta el final. No se ha llegado hasta el final.
Vamos, que hay alguien a quien le conviene la pervivencia de ETA.
Realmente, mientras esta exista, se estará falseando muchos debates y muchos problemas que hay en Euskadi y en otras partes. Yo que he sido partidario y he defendido el tema del diálogo en su momento, ya dije a partir de la T4 que fuera. Aquí ya no hay más que, para mí, esta es cuestión de jueces y policía, y punto, ya no, menos historia, ya no hay solución. Ahora creo, no obstante, que en última instancia los servicios secretos o determinados poderes, pues han podido ralentizar, porque siempre, en cuanto ha habido un asesinato, un crimen, una extorsión, automáticamente se refuerzan determinados controles y el conflicto parece que está abierto. Eso lo dije, es una sospecha que tengo, pero no es una sospecha producto de una noche de luna llena, ¿no? Que alguien me haya iluminado. Tengo personas que me han informado hace años, pero antes del 2004.
¿Qué cree don Julianita que pasó en el 11M?
Aquí tengo que hablar con mucha prudencia, porque no me seduce, no veo pruebas que avalen la tesis de ETA. No lo veo. Aunque yo soy persona que no cierra nada. Siempre tengo, mientras yo no sepa las cosas, siempre hay una lucecita. Pero...
¿Por qué hace el énfasis en la tesis de ETA?
Sí, porque es que usted sabe que aquí hay un debate que divide a muchos españoles y medios de comunicación, sobre si la tesis era ETA o era, diríamos, fundamentalismo árabe.
Pero ese es el debate en el que nos pretendieron cerrar a los ciudadanos. Si
Sí,
es usted de derechas, tiene que pensar que es ETA, si es usted de izquierdas, tiene que pensar
Por eso
que
digo,
es ETA.
pero todavía...
A lo mejor no es ni uno ni otro, ¿no?
Efectivamente, pero digo que todavía uno habla con esa... No quiero que me encorseten, en todo caso que me encorseten con lo que yo pienso, ¿no? Pero yo creo que ha habido mucha ligereza. No han sido castigados, que yo sepa, los que han aportado datos que se han demostrado falsos. Hay casos que se aportan pruebas que después se ve que no han tenido consistencia y que no se ha visto la sanción. Es decir, aquí me da la impresión que ha habido mucho barullo y que los jueces han hecho lo que han podido sabiendo que había barullo. Pero esto pasa como cuando han ocurrido escándalos, sobre todo escándalos económicos, que se han cortado. Yo todavía me acuerdo de la expresión del 3% que dice
Maragall.
Bueno, pues ese 3% que pasaba, parece ser que ahora hay algo que se va acercando al 1,5, por lo menos, ¿no? Y que está por ahí. Entonces, esto es hijo de la transición y de los pactos. Yo creo que todavía, algún día, saldrán informaciones, sin posicionarme, repito, en una tesis o la otra. No participo de ninguna de las dos.
¿Hay alguna otra tesis alternativa a esas dos?
No lo sé. No lo sé, pero confieso que lo veo tan oscuro como otras cuestiones. ¿Por qué? Porque otra vez estamos con implicaciones fuera de España, de alta política. Y no sé más, si no lo diría, porque cuando yo creo algo más me arriesgo.
Dal primo dirottamento sono passate quasi 2 ore. Questa è la mappa delle basi militari nella zona interessata ai dirottamenti di quel giorno. Nonostante questo, nessun caccia della difesa americana è riuscito ad avvicinarsi a uno solo dei 4 aerei dirottati. Mentre al NORAD si seguivano gli eventi in tempo reale, sulle varie piste i caccia attendevano inutilmente un ordine di decollo che per qualche motivo non arrivava mai. Una incredibile serie di errori, di comunicazioni sbagliate, di ordini prima dati poi ritirati, faceva ogni volta perdere minuti preziosi, impedendo ai caccia di fare quello che avevano sempre fatto fino a quel giorno. Questa è la cronologia ufficiale delle comunicazioni intercorse fra NORAD e Federal Aviation, che a tutt'oggi si rimpallano all'infinito le responsabilità per i disguidi. Fra le 8:20 e le 8:27 il primo aereo risultava già dirottato, ma ci voleva quasi mezz'ora questa volta perché i caccia si alzassero in volo dalla vicina base di Otis. American 11 faceva così in tempo a colpire la prima torre. Il secondo aereo dirottato entrava in quel momento negli schermi radar dell'aeroporto di Newark di fronte alle Torri Gemelle. Ma per qualche inspiegabile motivo, ai due caccia già in volo per New York veniva ordinato di proseguire a velocità ridotta. In questo modo, anche United 175 faceva in tempo a colpire la seconda torre. A quel punto i due caccia venivano inspiegabilmente mandati a parcheggiarsi in quota, al largo di Long Island, nonostante il terzo aereo avesse già interrotto i contatti da molti minuti. Mentre a quel punto doveva essere chiaro a tutti che si trattasse di un'azione concertata. E infatti altri due caccia pronti a decollare dalla pista di Langley, vicino a Washington, decidevano di farlo anche se l'ordine ufficiale continuava a non arrivare. Ma una volta in volo, quando già stavano puntando sull'aereo diretto sul Pentagono, venivano deviati verso Baltimora su un bersaglio inesistente da una telefonata dei servizi segreti della Casa Bianca. Pare che l'ordine arrivasse direttamente da Dick Cheney, il vicepresidente che sin dal primo mattino, per l'assenza di Bush dalla capitale, era saldamente al comando della situazione. Non solo questa serie incredibile di errori non è mai stata spiegata da nessuno, ma i responsabili ai più alti livelli della difesa, invece di venire processati, degradati o comunque puniti in qualche modo, venivano sorprendentemente promossi a posizioni ancora più prestigiose. La parlamentare democratica Cynthia McKinney ha chiesto ripetutamente al governo dei chiarimenti, ma fino ad oggi non ha ottenuto risposta.
Washington D.C. seems to be the only place where you can make repeated mistakes at the job, on the job, at the workplace, and get a promotion. My question to the panelists is, what does the fact that we have seen promotions instead of punishment for failure, what, if anything, does that tell us about the policy that these people who were promoted were carrying out?
When the United States was attacked without warning at Pearl Harbor, after 8 inquiries, General Walter Short, commander of the Army for the Defense of Hawaii, and Admiral Husband Kimmel, commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, were both charged with negligence and summarily dismissed. But after the 9/11 catastrophe, nobody, neither the Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, nor the head of civil aviation, nor that of air defense, was either punished or removed from office.
On September 10th, Brigadier General W. Montague Winfield asked Junior Officer Captain Charles Leidig to temporarily replace him as Director of Operations at the Pentagon Command Center from 8:30 a.m. on September 11th. Later that day, after Flight 93 was reported crashed, Winfield resumed control. Captain Leidig had only just completed a course qualifying him to run the command center. On September the 11th, Brigadier General David F. Worley Jr. was commander of the Andrews Air Force Base, the nearest one to the Pentagon. On September the 11th, Richard B. Myers, Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, in the absence of Chairman Shelton, was the temporary head of all U.S. Armed Forces.
Although we are told that 4 or 5 of the alleged hijackers were on each of the flights, if so, their names should have been on the flight manifests. But the flight manifests that have been released contain neither the names of the alleged hijackers nor any Arab names whatsoever.
We know that the men who were supposedly the hijackers had their houses, cars, credit cards paid for by the U.S. government. They were in truth agents.
Evidence was also apparently planted. The passport of one of the hijackers on Flight 11 was allegedly found in the Rebel.
Goes through the fireball, through the side of the plane, and comes down to the ground unscathed. But something happened. For 6 months, they reported they had this passport. Boy, we've got it. We've got the proof. And then the guy stood up and was alive.
Several of these 19 men are still alive.
"40 years ago, the steel used to build the World Trade Center was certified by Underwriters Laboratories, a global product compliance and public safety guardian. Let's hear a lone voice that spoke out from this enormous company."
My name is Kevin Ryan, and I'm formerly a manager at Underwriters Laboratories. I was fired from my job 5 days after sending a letter to a government scientist at the NIST questioning the report that the NIST had recently released in October of 2004. I wrote this letter because I had serious questions about what I saw in the report. Those questions went back to September of 2001 when UL's CEO came to our location in South Bend. He told our entire staff that the World Trade Center steel had been certified by UL, and he said that we should be proud of how long the buildings had stood. Over the next 2 years, I did some research and found some very disturbing facts, including that the steel had been disposed of in an unprecedented manner. Once I discovered those facts, I sent a written question to UL CEO asking him about these things and what he was doing to protect our reputation as a company. He replied in writing to me that UL did, in fact, test the steel. He talked about the quality of the sample and how well it had performed in the tests. And he said that our company had tested the steel and that it had done beautifully. After that, he asked me to be patient and wait for the NIST report because UL was working closely with them. I saw this report in October of 2004, and in November, I sent my letter to NIST asking for clarification. I felt it was an obligation on my part to ask the questions, since no one else seemed to care to. After the 1993 bombing, the fireproofing in both buildings was updated considerably. But when you look at the NIST report, you don't see any testing that showed that a 767 would widely dislodge the fireproofing under any impact, let alone so far from the point of impact. So now we've been left with a new theory that is not really a theory at all, but only a collection of vague statements. The NIST report represents what can really only be called anti-science. They started with their conclusions and worked their way back to some leading hypotheses. When the results of the physical tests showed that the temperatures were far too low to soften steel, and that the floors could not have collapsed, and that the fireproofing could not have been widely dislodged, the NIST ignored these results and built a black box computer model that no one can argue with and that would spit out the right answers. Today, anyone who's conscious enough to know what's happening in the world knows that most government policy is being driven by this false story.
Track down and punish the perpetrators of this attack. This is being seen on Capitol Hill as another Pearl Harbor, as another Pearl Harbor, as another Pearl Harbor.
The steel in dragon-like lengths and contortions spoke for itself. Bent, deformed, without cracks.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
Typically you'd have buckling and tearing on the tension side, but there's no buckling at all. There's no buckling at all.
Here is the meteorite, molten iron fused with concrete.
And architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
It is true that heat expands steel. In a fire, steel members may swell and bend slightly. But this, How could these huge tangles have been created? The steel below the towers had melted at many thousands of degrees. Since metal conducts heat, were these twisted remains formed by high temperatures wicking their way through a gridwork of steel? Explosives also deform steel. As they fire, gas pushes outward. The force of the gas can easily bend a large steel column. Two kinds of debris, huge shattered columns that could break a truck, combined with matter that was near pulverized. These core columns were discovered after the collapse. The angled cut occurs in exactly the manner that shaped charges slice through steel beams to control the way they fall. Notice the hardened once liquid metal. Was thermite used with the shaped charge?
The job of the shaped charge is to cut steel H-beams.
The way we do this is by cutting the beam at an angle, which through a series of beams cut at the same angle will tend to make the building shift over and walk.
Let's look at the rubble of two 110-story buildings brought to the ground. In a 7-story crater lie nearly 2 million tons of debris. Had the basements not been blown out, where would 2 million tons have gone? Heaped on the ground, ready to slide and spill? The art of controlled demolition. An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. This is thermite melting the engine of a car. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. The second product of a thermite reaction is aluminum oxide, visible as white smoke. Was thermite used in conjunction with explosives on September 11th? Watch this very bright substance pouring from the 81st floor of the South Tower. And white smoke appeared at the base of the building. Would this be aluminum oxide, the byproduct of a thermite reaction? Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Dødstallet er foreløbig nået op på 150, mens 1500 er med kvæster. Internationale forskere har fundet spor af sprængstoffer i ruinerne af World Trade Center. I en ny videnskabelig artikel får det forskerne til at konkludere, at det formentlig ikke var sammenstødende med de 2 kaprede fly, der i 2001 fik World Trade-tårnene til at kollapse. Så vender vi blikket imod 9/11, det store angreb i New York. Det var nemlig formentlig ikke sammenstødet med de 2 kaprede fly, der i 2001 fik de 2 tvillingetårne til at kollapse. Det konkluderer i hvert fald en netop offentliggjort videnskabelig artikel. Internationale forskere har gjort fund af sprængstoffet nanotermit i ruinerne af de sammenstyrtede tårne, og sprængstoffet kan ikke stamme fra de 2 fly. Tværtimod tyder undersøgelserne på, at det formentlig i forvejen var anbragt i bygningerne, og der er altså tale om flere tons sprængstof. Niels Harrit, Du har sammen med 8 andre forskere lavet den her artikel, hvor I konkluderer, at det formentlig var stoffet nanotermit, som forårsagede sammenstyrtningerne i de her bygninger. Hvad er nanotermit for en størrelse?
At vi har fundet nanotermit i støvet fra sammenstyrtning af World Trade Center. Vi siger ikke, at der kun blev brugt nanotermit. Men nanotermit, hvis jeg skal forklare, hvad det er, så den sidste del af ordet termit, det er en gammel opfindelse faktisk fra 1893, som er en blanding af aluminium og pulveriseret rust, som hvis det reagerer med hinanden, udvikler en enorm varme. Der dannes i reaktionen jern, som er 2500 grader varmt, og det kan man bruge til at svejse med, det har man gjort, det er meget nyttigt, men det kan også bruges til at smelte andet jern. Men i nanoteknologien, der bliver alting meget mindre. Så de her 2 pulver, som man lavede i 1893, er nu om dagen nogle bitte små partikler, som er blandet umådeligt godt med hinanden. Og det betyder, at når de reagerer, så udvikles denne her enorme varme meget hurtigere. Og samtidig kan man tilsætte andre stoffer, således at nanotermitter både kan virke som noget, der giver en masse varme, men det kan også virke som et meget effektivt sprængstof. Faktisk er der mere energi i nanotermitter, end der er i almindelige sprængstoffer og dynamit. Og man kan også bruge det som raketsprængstof, så det kan bruges til det hele.
Jeg var inde og google på nanotermit, og der er faktisk ikke skrevet så forfærdeligt meget om det. Er det et bredt anerkendt videnskabeligt stof, som man opererer med, eller er det så nyt, at det er næsten ukendt for mange andre fagfolk?
Altså det er en samlet betegnelse for en masse materialer, energetiske materialer, der har energi. Og hvis der ikke er så mange, der kender det, så skyldes det måske, at civile forskere, som jeg, ikke beskæftiger sig normalt med sprængstoffer til hverdag. Og med hensyn til mine kolleger inden for det militære forskningsapparat, så må du hellere spørge dem, fordi jeg ved jo ikke, hvor meget de er på forkant med nanoteknologi.
Men altså, I har fundet det her stof i World Trade Center, og hvorfor mener I, at det har fået bygningerne til at kollapse?
Ja, det er jo sprængstof, og hvorfor skulle det ellers være det? Men
det er varmeudviklingen, I mener, der simpelthen har smeltet stålkonstruktionerne, som jo ellers skulle kunne holde bygningerne oppe, at det er i virkeligheden det, der har fået bygningerne til at kollapse som korthus?
Ja, hvis jeg skal svare på det helt præcist, så ved vi det ikke endnu. Fordi det materiale, vi har fundet, har mulighed for både at fungere som sprængstof, som altså direkte slår tingene over, og det har mulighed for at smelte stålet. Sandsynligvis er der brugt begge slags. Altså det er min egen opfattelse af det, at der er en lang periode inden tårnene styrter sammen, hvor der for eksempel vælter med smeltet metal ud af det sydlige tårn flere minutter inden. Og det er et tegn på, at der er en proces inden selve sammenstyrtning, hvor man har svækket hele strukturen. Og så kommer der mere konventionelle, regulære sprængstoffer ind til de der. Selve sammenstyrtningssekvensen skal være enormt godt synkroniseret. Altså det er jo en hel række sprængninger, som man kan se hele vejen ned, når tårnene styrter sammen.
Hvor store mængder taler man om? Hvor meget skal der til?
Det er meget, fordi der var 3 skyskraber. Skal vi lige få det ind? Der var 3 skyskraber, men der var 2 flyvemaskiner. Og vi har jo selvfølgelig en nogenlunde fornemmelse af, hvor meget støv, der er blevet dannet. Og det kan man se på alle mulige billeder. Der er enorme støvmængder, som der kom. Alt blev pulveriseret, undtagen af selve jernskelettet. Og vi ved nogenlunde, hvor meget rester vi har fundet af ureageret termit. Det er the loaded gun, det her. Det er ikke det, der er blevet brugt. Det er det, der af en eller anden grund ikke har reageret. Og så, vi snakker om tons, vi snakker om over 10 tons, måske 100 tons.
10 tons, 100 tons i 3 bygninger? Ja. Og vi taler altså ikke om materiale, som normalt indgår i bygninger af skyskrabere?
Nej. Det er super avanceret materiale, det her.
Men hvordan placerer man sådan noget i skyskrabere på alle etagerne? Altså
hvordan man får det ind?
Ja.
På paller. Ja, det vil jeg da. Altså, hvis jeg skulle transportere de mængder, ville jeg da køre det ind på paller. Fast en lastbil, og så kørt ind på paller.
Hvorfor har man ikke opdaget det noget før? Eller før?
Hvem skulle opdage det?
I Portland for eksempel, altså at man kører rundt med 10-100 tons nanotermit, som man placerer på etagerne i store sække, eller jeg ved ikke, hvad man gør. Altså, det undrer mig bare, at man ikke har opdaget det.
Jamen, det spørgsmål skal du jo som journalist stille til det firma, som stod for kontrollen, for sikkerhedskontrollen i World Trade Center.
Men I er i hvert fald ikke i tvivl om, at materialet har været der?
Ja, det er sådan en videnskab, du kan ikke rigtig snyde der, at vi har fundet det. Og det er ureageret til mit.
Hvilken modtagelse har jeres artikel fået rundt omkring i verden? Altså det er jo helt ny viden for mig også.
Ja. Nu udkom den altså i fredags, så det kan vi ikke rigtig sige endnu. Men der er ikke så stor nyhedsværdi i det her, som du måske tror. Fordi at de 3 skyskrabere blev revet ned, det er der 100.000 vis af mennesker over hele verden, der ved. Fordi det har været krystalklart længe af mange andre grunde, end det jeg kommer med her. Det her, det er kun det sidste søm i kisten. Altså, fordi, som sagt, det er ikke the smoking gun, det her, det er the loaded gun. Og antallet af mennesker, som indser, at World Trade Center blev revet ned, de vokser med tusindvis om dagen. Det er ikke noget, du bare sådan kan stoppe, så det skal nok komme.
Hvordan kan det være, at man ikke har opdaget, at der har været nanotermit i bygningerne tidligere? Altså, vi har jo snart 10 års jubilæum på terrorangrebet, og det kan jo egentlig undre, at man ikke har fundet det tidligere.
Altså i støvet, mener du?
Ja.
Det blev fordi det er lidt tilfældigt, at der også er en, der kiggede på støvet i et mikroskop, og det er sådan nogle små røde chips, altså de største er millimeter og ned efter, så de allerstørste kan du se med det blotte øje, men langt de fleste af dem skal du altså have et mikroskop frem for at finde. Og så det var lidt et tilfælde, det er lidt over 2 år siden, at der var en, der opdagede det. Og den videnskabelige artikel, som du refererer til her, og som udkom i fredags, den har været 1,5 år undervejs. Det er en meget omfattende artikel, det er meget grundigt arbejde, og det laver man ikke fra den ene dag til den anden.
Building 7 and the Twin Towers share one utterly bewildering similarity: the presence of molten metal found in the debris of all 3 buildings weeks after the collapse.
Is this molten metal that we have now studied at length that came from these buildings and existed then in pools underneath the rubble of all 3 skyscrapers, both towers and Building 7.
A metallographic analysis was conducted by a specialized institute that examined the structure of a girder taken from Ground Zero.
Quando sono state sfilate queste travi, la parte che era sotto le macerie pare.
When these girders were extracted from under the rubble, it seems as if parts of them had melted. This is totally inexplicable because the temperatures reached by the fires could only have been 800 degrees at the most. To melt a steel girder, you have to reach temperatures of around 1600 degrees. How could this be? At a microscopic level, if you examine the granular structure of the steel, one can detect the presence of an element that should not normally be present, and it is there in substantial quantities. It is sulfur.
We're quite sure now where this molten metal came from. It comes from a material called thermate, which is aluminum powder, iron oxide, and sulfur.
The temperature is so high that steel melts. It could only melt if the temperature reached over 1,000 degrees in a few seconds. The use of thermite could certainly have caused the fusion apparent in the steel beams.
You see, the presence of thermite now in these buildings to bring them down implies that someone had to place the thermite near the steel columns in order to cut through the columns. I have interviewed a demolition expert, and he said this is what they do. They set explosives. They can use radio control to initiate the firing of the explosive, they have to be done in a sequence in order to get the building to come down rapidly and straight down. A controlled demolition. Scientists, we look at different hypotheses, different explanations, but then we have to look at all the data to see which explanation fits the best. You have to incorporate all the picture. Yes, you may take an isolated fact like the plume and say, well, perhaps that was a high air pressure that somehow blew a window out. But that will not account for the molten metal or the sulfidation or the molten pools.
When the South Tower collapsed and blew into my apartment directly across from the World Trade Center, I saved the dust. I gave it to Stephen Jones.
The dust that was provided by Mrs. McKinley is very interesting because it's like a snapshot of the residue being produced by the tower during its collapse. It's perfect. Now we look in the dust and we see metal droplets. And when I saw that, I thought, whoa. This is what I expect from thermite because I've done a number of thermite experiments and you get small metal drops being thrown out in all directions. And this is what we see in the dust now, these little metal drops. We also see barium. This is very interesting because barium nitrate and sulfur are part of the military patent on what is known as thermate. This is thermite with sulfur and barium nitrate added to make this material cut more rapidly through steel. Now, barium is a very toxic metal, so one would not ordinarily expect this to be present in the large concentrations that we see. Well, the fact that we see it in these and in the dust is a very strong indication to me that the military form of thermite that has been used.
Shifted up to 18 inches inward.
These walls are coming in. These walls hold back the river. So if these walls cave in, this place is going to get flooded out by the river.
Let's think about this. A pancake collapse should have left the foundations in place. They had always borne the weight of 110 floors, but something happened in the sub-basements to disrupt them.
All the collapse had gone down at the track level, so we had 60, 70 feet of wall, totally unsupported.
What kind of force could have dislodged so many stories deep underground?
And there was a huge explosion.
Was it hit by something, or was it something inside?
It was inside. Because it looked out, everything was coming out. It was inside.
And that's massive neutron influx. They come in, they start getting it hot, and it's still getting hot as they're going through. It takes a little bit of time for that heat to billion pounds of building turned into 2 billion pounds of micronized dust. We have massive craters, 200 feet wide around World Trade Center 1, 2, and a giant hole in World Trade Center 6 that's 40 foot deep. You know, you got 5 acres of land at 1,800 degrees in a matter of seconds.
6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright, bright reddish orange color.
Down below and you see molten steel running down the channel rails, like you're in a foundry. Like lava from a volcano.
He sees the potentials, and he sees the problems. To investigate both and to develop the technology that will turn potentials into realities, the United States is conducting, for the benefit of all nations, a program it calls Plowshare. The 100-kiloton nuclear explosion excavated more than 6 million cubic yards of earth in a matter of seconds. The result was a crater more than 1,200 feet in diameter, the length of 4 football fields, and 325 feet deep, the height of a 32-story building, created in less time than it takes to describe it. And the dust cloud. Just as with radiation, these other safety problems are subject to control by selecting the minimum yield necessary to do the job.
Based on the evidence, the final roll sequences after pre-weakening with thermite and shaped charges was most likely done with nuclear explosives. Don't think of Hiroshima. If the United States Army was loading nuclear shells by hand into howitzers 50 years ago, what do you think is available in the 21st century? The evidence for the use of nuclear explosives on 9/11 is substantial. A government report tried to spin the appearance of the radioactive isotope tritium at ground zero in concentrations dozens of times higher than the surrounding area. Hundreds of cars at ground zero burst into flames from the inside out. This is explained with the characteristic electromagnetic pulse of nuclear explosions overloading the vehicle's electronics, causing the vehicles to ignite. It would be foolish to conclude that aviation-grade kerosene would cause this kind of selective damage while leaving truckloads of loose paper around the site untouched. Toxic fumes produced by fires from the continuously reacting thermite and radiation from the final roll sequences explain why 7 out of 10 people with significant exposure to ground zero are dying from a host of illnesses.
Barium and strontium were both found in the dust, elements that have no business being there at all. Not only were they found, but the concentrations were correlated. In the samples where barium went up, strontium also went up. And the sample with the highest concentration was the only one taken right at ground zero. A nuclear event would also explain this. Ground Zero fumed for over 100 days through rainstorms, freezing temperatures, and constant watering. Judy Wood identifies the effect as ongoing molecular dissociation.
What is this haze? Is it fire? Fire would have a point source. You could see where the fire was coming from, where it would be the strongest. Also, smoke tends to go up. This is just looming over the ground zero remnants. No point source, it's just hanging around there. What is it? This photo was taken at the end of October, Halloween, actually. But what is this white around here? If it were hot, these people would be cooked like on a grill. And its hydraulics wouldn't work. Not only that, they'd permanently destroy their equipment.
A nuclear fission chain reaction, once begun, continues until all the fissionable material is gone. This is the so-called China syndrome, where heavy reacting elements burn downwards through everything. Could that be what caused this? This hole in the bedrock is directly under where the South Tower stood. The workers are filling in the hole with concrete. The surrounding rock appears to have melted and then re-solidified. Janitor Felipe David was working inside the North Tower. His co-worker, Willie Rodriguez, describes skin that was hanging off his body.
Everybody started screaming, and a person comes running into the office saying, "Explosion, explosion, explosion." He got his hand extended, and all the skin was pulled from his under his arm, all the way to the top of the fingertips, and he was hanging on both arms. Hanging and hanging.
Exactly the same type of horrific radiation effect was described at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Inexplicable numbers of ground zero workers are coming down with rare cancers like leukemia and thyroid cancer. According to medical doctor Ed Ward, only radiation can explain this. First responder Matthew Tartaglia.
In January and February of 2002, it became clear that I was very, very sick. I started sweating constantly. I would just walk down the hall.
Sí, vamos a ver, los atentados de Torres Gemelas eran atentados nucleares. ¿Tú conoces la frase zona cero? No. La famosa ground zero, zona cero, ¿no? Lo que se dice en Nueva York, no la zona...
Sí,
claro. ¿Tú has mirado alguna vez en el diccionario inglés lo que significa la frase zona cero? No. Si miras, te llevarías una sorpresa. La definición en inglés de zona cero es punto de explosión atómico o nuclear. Y esto te debería haber dicho todo. Es decir, las Torres Gemelas cayeron por atentados, por explosiones nucleares de 150 kilotoneladas que estaban colocados a una profundidad de 77 metros por debajo de la superficie, y a nivel de inteligencia militar, sobre todo yo vengo de una división que está vinculado a la 12ª, que es de inteligencia nuclear rusa, todos lo sabíamos que esto iba a pasar.
explain to you. You see, let's say this is our tower. And this is the Earth's surface. Our nuclear charge is here. The first, it will create a primary size of the cavity. In result, it will be because of the disappearance of the rock. It will be evaporated. And then the pressure of the gases, which is a former rock, will try to expand the cavity. So it will expand the cavity a little bit. And then the next area will be already compressed by this process. So it will create the three zones. The outer one is a damaged zone. This is the border of damaged zone. And this is the border of crushed zone. And this is the border of the cavity. And all of them will expand, mostly to this direction. So before the foundation of the tower will be reached by the border of expanding cavity, it will be first reached by the border of the damaged zone, which will continue to propagate upwards until it reaches some, maybe 350 meters. Okay? And then it will be followed by the border of the crushed zone, which will continue the same way until it reaches maybe 300 meters. And only then it will be reached by the end of the expanding cavity. So in this process, as you can see, the first tower will be damaged into small pieces until 350 meters. And immediately it will be also pulverized up to 300 meters. So this will be dust, complete microscopic dust.
So the
very
tower,
typical
the
for the crushed
steel,
zone.
the computers, the desks, the chairs, the
Even
carpet.
the human beings.
Dust.
Everything will be just transformed to complete microscopic dust. And this area will be damaged into small debris. And because the tower was above 400 meters, this part will be still undamaged, means solid and heavy. So by the gravitational forces, it will, in the next second, it will just press down. So that is exactly why when they demolished the building 7, they managed not to touch US Post Office and Verizon buildings to that sites, but they were not able to avoid damaging the other building.
I see. And in the same picture just below, we see that you've positioned where the charges were on 1 and 2.
Yes.
Because they weren't directly under the towers,
No,
were they?
They were a little bit, the actual hypocenters of explosions, they were not exactly in the middle of the tower's footprints, but a little bit away from it. That's why there was some surviving corner, as you can see in these pictures. I make it in green. And I think there are also photographs. Yeah, I will show it to you.
But I have to ask you, Dmitry,
like this,
how were you able to calculate that it wasn't in the center?
It is quite easy to calculate. As you can see that this photograph is one of the surviving corner.
So let me fully understand this. What you're saying is, there's the tower.
Yes.
The explosion's slightly off center, so the effect running up the tower
I better make a
is
draw.
also slightly off
So
center.
it will be easy to understand if I draw. Okay, let's imagine that this is our tower. And the position of the charge is exactly at the middle.
Yes.
So the damaged and crushed zone will propagate more or less equally.
Yes.
Okay, but if the tower is like this, but the position of nuclear charge is here, not exactly at the footprint, little bit away from it. So it will produce the zones which go this way,
yes,
and they might save these corners.
So by looking at the corner, you're able to calculate how off center the charge was?
Yes, it is quite easy to calculate.
Well, can I ask you then, what happens to the blast wave when it gets to the surface and hits the atmosphere?
It can't be called blast wave, we would better call it crushing wave.
Crushing wave.
It will just pulverize everything on its way. So it will pulverize the part of the tower and also part of the remaining Earth surface here.
Yes. But what happens when it hits the air?
Nothing. Because it's like a compression wave. It will not.
So it's compressing only where it meets resistance?
Yes.
and pulverizing anything that resists. And if it gets into the air, then
so it's just air.
Right. I understand. So you were able to look at the damage and calculate exactly where the zero box would have been.
Yes, it is quite easy to calculate if you look at this picture. This one is an aerial photograph, and it's a bigger one, and this is official photograph, as you can see. There is a credit of September 23. You can clearly see that hypocenters were here, here, and here. Oh, you can see it in the bigger photograph. It's clear, you can just see it.
Okay.
And I would say that I was not alone who arrived to this conclusion, because there was one famous French writer. Actually, you can see his drawing here.
Yes.
And as you can see that he positioned his charge exactly as the same as in my calculation.
And he's
in between one of the Twin Towers and the Marriott Hotel.
Yes.
And he positioned it also 50 meters below the ground, the lowest underground foundation of the tower, meaning 77 meters. You can look at this Spanish El Mundo newspaper, which was released a few days after September 11, and you can see clearly the number of portable nuclear devices ascribed to Osama bin Laden is 3, not 2.
3 Ukrainian nuclear devices.
Yes, you can see even their numbers and their models according to the Soviet classification.
So that's part of a cover-up story to patricians.
Yes.
Look, it's
to the middle level of the...
Right.
Yes.
What do you suggest is the reason for the destruction of World Trade Center 7?
World Trade Center 7 was a command center of the entire World Trade Center complex. So the nuclear devices, they were not kept under the World Trade Center 1 and 2. They were kept under the World Trade Center 7, and at the time of destruction they have to be delivered under the Twin Towers by some underground railway, mini railway, which was made in some tunnels. As you can see that many people cannot explain why the first tower was hit by the plane, collapsed second, and vice versa. The explanation is very easy. This is the structure of the World Trade Center complex. So this is the World Trade Center 7, and this is the Twin Towers. You can see that World Trade Center 2 was farther from World Trade Center 7, and World Trade Center 1 was closer to it. And the delivery tunnels were leading like this. That is why it was not possible to demolish this tower before this tower, otherwise the demolition wave underground would demolish the delivery tunnel for this tower. So this tower must be demolished first, and then only this tower. And after that, the people who demolished these Twin Towers, they have no choice than to demolish the World Trade Center 7 as well, because otherwise the inquiry will find out all of this stuff. So they have to destroy it completely. So luckily, the World Trade Center 7 was scheduled to be demolished by the same way, so they have the 3 nuclear devices actually. So they just used the third one to demolish it and to hide the evidence completely. And then they have no problem in explaining it. At least it would be easier to hide the fact that the World Trade Center 7 was demolished, as they did in the actual report of September 11 Commission. Then, in case if the inquiry come to the World Trade Center 7 and find the third nuclear device there in the delivery tunnels, it will be difficult to explain what is that. So they just prefer lesser of the evils.
Are you telling me that Israel was involved in planning 9/11?
Oh, definitely yes, because actually, you see, I can't say that they were involved in the planning because I was not sitting in the same table with them planning that, okay? But outwardly, yes, because For example, I can see by the reaction of Mike Harari in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 that he was just in the celebrating mood. He even invited me to the celebratory breakfast on the 12th of September 2001. So it means if it, for example, it was like something new for them, he would probably be shocked. But he was very happy and celebrating, and he was actually claiming that it is a happiest moment in his life.
So the Israeli intelligence treated 9/11 as though it were a successful operation.
At least Mike Harari was celebrating that, and the other Mossad agent who introduced me to Mike Harari was also celebrating that.
Do you have his name? Can you give us that name?
You see, Mike Harari's name, yes, but the younger guy who introduced me to him, I only know the name that he used in Bangkok, but I'm not quite sure if it is his real name or not. Because he was also using an Arabic name.
What was his cover name in Bangkok?
Yeah, because they don't use their real names.
Okay.
But this guy, under his Arabic name, he is well known also to the American FBI because they also attempted to get his extradition under Arabic name. According to Arabic name, his name is Hani Hamor.
Okay, that's very good. Now, from what I understand, you felt that there was an attempt at some point to involve you in, on the part of Israel, to involve you as appearing as a terrorist. That they, for instance, was something involving the Bali bombings?
You see, because these guys apparently use the fact that I used to serve in the nuclear technical service. I mean, what I say that the 12th chief directorate of the defense ministry of the former USSR is the nuclear technical service of the armed forces, the organization responsible for the safekeeping of the nuclear weapons. So these guys apparently, how it appears to me, once they learn where I served, they just want to maybe make some stupid story, just like making me responsible for illegal selling of the nuclear weapons to terrorists or something like this. Because I noticed that even before my acquaintance with Mike Harari, some guys were approaching me with the proposals of, like to give them some consultation on nuclear weapons or translate some documentations from Russian to English on nuclear weapons and so on. So I noticed some dirty game actually a long time ago, but I didn't take it seriously. So before I was arrested.
Reuters reported that Comvar, a German computer company, is responsible for helping companies and accountants in New York restore their data from over 400 hard drives that were recovered from the World Trade Center's rubble. Comvar recovered information from 32 different computers that suggested insider trading took place on 9/11. Richard Wagner, an expert at Comvar. There is a suspicion that some people had advanced knowledge of the approximate time of the plane crashes in order to move out amounts exceeding $100 million. They thought that the records of their transactions could not be traced after the mainframes were destroyed. After their analysis, Comvar handed the results over to the FBI. Although the FBI was legally bound to investigate who was responsible, to date they have done no such thing. Moving on. According to Wikipedia, one of the world's largest gold depositories was stored underneath the World Trade Center. In 1993, the value of the gold was estimated at $1 billion, rumored to be owned by Kuwaiti interests. When the World Trade Center was destroyed, the amount of gold far exceeded the 1993 levels. The gold was finally recovered in its entirety in late 2001. Or was it? On November 1st, 2001, the Times Online reported that a large amount of gold was discovered in the wreckage of the World Trade Center. Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that more than $230 million was recovered from Ground Zero. However, the COMEX Metals Trading Division was storing gold bars for the Bank of Nova Scotia, Chase Manhattan Bank, Bank of New York, Hong Kong, and Shanghai Banking, totaling $950 million. And that's just one company. Rumor has it that over $160 billion in gold was stored in the World Trade Center. So where did all the gold go? Remember the gold that was found in November 2001? Reuters reported that it was discovered in the back of a 10-wheel truck, along with several cars, in a delivery tunnel underneath World Trade Center 5. No bodies were recovered. As workers got closer to the gold, authorities began restricting access to Ground Zero, joined by FBI and Secret Service agents. One worker, who was directed away from the tunnel, told a reporter, "If I tried to go down there, they would have shot me." Heavy machinery operators and others worked under the watchful eye of more than 100 armed officers. So let me get this straight. Gold from World Trade Center 4 was found underneath World Trade Center 5 in an empty delivery truck with an empty escort of cars. I think it's safe to say that they were running away from the South Tower. The question is, how did they know to flee from their stash when not even the firefighters inside the South Tower expected it to collapse?
Il World Trade Center Plaza era un insieme di 7 edifici destinati ad uso commerciale, collocato nella punta sud dell'isola di Manhattan. Oltre alle torri gemelle 1 e 2, comprendeva anche gli edifici chiamati World Trade Center 3, 4, 5, 6 e 7. Quest'ultimo era l'unico ad essere fuori dal perimetro della plaza vera e propria, ed era entrato a far parte del complesso solo nell'agosto del 2001, quando il suo proprietario, Larry Silverstein, era riuscito a coronare il sogno della sua vita, acquistando dalla città di New York le torri più famose del mondo. Ma solo un mese dopo l'intero complesso andava distrutto dagli attacchi terroristici. E mentre nessuno degli edifici circostanti subiva danni sostanziali, alcune ore dopo le torri crollava anche inspiegabilmente proprio l'edificio numero 7.
Similarly, Larry Silverstein, new leaseholder of the World Trade Center, regretfully declared that a decision was made to pull Building 7 by the end of the day, the last structure added to the World Trade Center complex. Let's hear Mr. Silverstein's actual words, delivered for our benefit in the 2002 PBS documentary America Rebuilds.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, you know, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
La migliore squadra di demolizioni controllate difficilmente avrebbe potuto ottenere un risultato migliore lavorando e calcolando le cadute per intere settimane.
Blast, shoot, blow, and pull are terms used in the demolition industry to refer to bringing down buildings, bridges, and other structures.
Because I actually blew the hospital down that I was born in.
Originally, we had figured to shoot it, let it drop straight down.
Then, watch Demolition Dynamics attempt a big blast.
And from Ground Zero's own post-disaster wrecking crew.
By mid-December, the Department of Design and Construction had leveled World Trade Center buildings 4 and 5.
Hello? Oh, we're getting ready to pull building 6.
Silverstein, a commercial real estate tycoon with international political connections, acquired a 99-year lease on the World Trade Center complex in the spring of 2001. Throughout the summer, he reworked the insurance policies on his new property, making sure that it was covered for acts of terrorism. Explicit in the lease agreement was Silverstein's right to rebuild the complex if it were destroyed. After 9/11, Mr. Silverstein fought his insurers in court to obtain double his policy limits for the destruction of his property, maintaining that the double hijacking constituted 2 disasters caused by terrorists, not just one. He won and was awarded over $7 billion, a magnificent return on his original $15 million investment.
My first reaction is to think about the families of those people, the tragedy, the magnitude of it. However, I firmly believe that we should rebuild.
Just in the last few seconds, another building, building number 7, one of the buildings
in support of the World Trade Center towers has collapsed.
World Trade 7, functioning as the command center for the complex, housed giant diesel backup and oxygen systems, the mayor's protected emergency bunker, and offices for the CIA, Secret Service, Department of Defense, and Securities and Exchange Commission. Its other tenants were insurance companies, brokerages, and banks. No plane hit Building 7, but at 5:20 p.m. on September 11th, it collapsed in a heap on the ground. Some damage to Building 7 is said to have been caused by debris from Tower 1. Though this New York Times article tells us Building 7 burned like a giant torch, the only visuals that exist are of unidentified smoke and a few small fires. Compare this to the wallop sustained by World Trade Center 3, 4, 5, and 6. Positioned right below the towers, damage to the surrounding World Trade Center buildings was infinitely worse. Still, the structures held up. But somehow, rescue workers knew that Building 7 would fall.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down soon.
A 47-story skyscraper, Building 7 folded neatly in 6.5 seconds, a textbook descent right into its footprint. Silverstein Properties now tells us that its owner was referring to the team of firefighters inside the building when he spoke of the decision to pulling the firemen out of harm's way. However, there were no firefighters in Building 7, according to FEMA, NIST, and Fire Chief Frank Fellini. They were ordered out at 11:30 that morning. 6 hours later, the building came down.
You know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and, you know, it was horrifying. About a second later, the bottom floor caves out, and the building followed after that.
Radio host Alex Jones notes the mark of a classic implosion.
This is a photo taken 1 second into Building 7's collapse. Notice the crimp. If we look at other controlled demolitions, we see that they first blow one of the central columns so the building falls in on itself. If you don't do this, the building falls outward and can damage surrounding structures. Building 7 had a classic crimp or wedge. Its central column was blown out first, so it didn't structurally damage buildings just a few feet away from it.
Remember the mayor's emergency bunker? Ensconced on the 23rd floor of Building 7, it was retrofitted with superglass, water, oxygen, and its own generator. But Mayor Giuliani chose to find emergency shelter elsewhere on September 11th. Why Building 7? Even the media and its experts were confused. The History Channel interviews structural engineer Ramon Gil-Sanz, who points out the obvious crimp and even speaks of the implosion.
Engineers are not just focusing on the Twin Towers. The most disturbing structural event was not that the Twin Towers fell, but that Tower 7, ignited by flying debris, fell due to fire alone.
Building 7 was a steel frame building, and is the first steel frame building that has collapsed due to fire. The failure of the building was an implosion, so it failed completely different than Towers 1 and 2, in which the floors failed first.
Why Building 7? Let's ask the question again. As the WTC Command Center, was it the hub for the 9/11 plan? Also, in 6.5 seconds, lost forever were thousands of SEC case files on corporate fraud, including those relating to the notorious activities of giants WorldCom and Enron. A few indictments for stock fraud, but what of the $70 billion California electricity swindle? It disappeared.
Se especula que en este edificio se encontraba el centro de control de los ataques. Destruirlo era simplemente eliminar evidencia. Parece que los medios de comunicación tenían ya el guión de lo que ocurriría ese día. Algunos cometiendo el error de narrar el hecho antes de que este ocurriera.
I want to tell you that we are getting word from New York right now that another building has collapsed. I understand that this is a 47-story building. Do we have pictures of it? I guess that's smoke now. Correct me if I'm wrong in the control room, please. But is that smoke coming from this third collapse? Okay, that is what we're understanding, which makes sense because it looks like the sun is going down. But the heavy black smoke once again.
Look at that.
Hopefully at this point that building was empty, but I have no way of knowing that. But I'm hoping that enough people have cleared out of downtown Manhattan so that perhaps it wasn't as full as it might be normally around 5:30 on a Tuesday.
That information, of course, take a look at that right-hand side of the screen.
It's going down right now.
There it is.
Yep.
It went down right there. This is not from an explosion or an aircraft at this point, from our knowledge.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Presumably there were very few people in the Salomon building when it collapsed. I mean, there were, I suppose, fears of possible further collapses around the area.
That's what you would hope, because this whole downtown area behind me has been completely sealed off and evacuated, apart from the emergency workers. That was done by the mayor.
After 4 p.m., news outlets began reporting that the building had collapsed.
We are getting information now that one of the other buildings, Building 7 in the World Trade Center complex, is on fire and has either collapsed or is collapsing.
The entire U.S. ruling class, ruling elite, comes to see terrorism as the preferred means, indeed the only means, to provide social cohesion, to provide an enemy image for the society to keep it together. According to neocon theory from Carl Schmitt, you have to have an enemy image in order to have a society. It's a very dangerous thing, because now it means that the entire social order, the political parties, intellectual life, politics in general, all based on a monstrous myth